Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody. I see that we have about 57 participants in the second session of our seminar on family and fertility. And we are starting late, as you can obviously tell. We're about 20 minutes behind schedule. So what I would like to do is just to extend our time together by 20 minutes. I know that's very tough for those of you who are in East Asia right now, but given that you've stayed awake this long, I hope you can stay awake 20 minutes longer to accommodate our speakers. We have a wonderful set of 4 papers, and I've asked the speakers to keep the talks to about 16, 17 minutes, so that will give us 20 minutes or so at the end of all 4 of the papers, as if PAA or other conferences, to have questions from the audience. So why don't we just get started right away? And I will ask the first presenters, Amy Thornton and Martin Wittenberg, if they could share their screen and go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm just going to try share my screen. Okay, great. Let me just get my presentation.
Perfect.
Okay, does that look fine? Okay, well, thanks so much. So, hi everybody. My name is Amy Thornton, and I'm a PhD student in the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And this work that I'm doing on home leaving is part of my PhD work, and I'm being supervised by Prof. Martin Wittenberg, so this is joint work with him. All right, so just to introduce the topic, what I'm studying is home leaving, or leaving the parental home, which is an event that usually happens in or during young adulthood, which has been now famously described as a demographically dense period of the life cycle, because there are a lot of firsts that happen in this time. Sexual debut, the onset of parenthood, end of education, first job, first marriage, for example. And because of this, home leaving in conjunction with these other events and their sequencing and their timing is often studied in the transition to adulthood literature, where these key events are sort of taken as markers of adulthood. But this is a bit more complex in the developing world, where sometimes, for example, children will be married off, or children will enter the labor market, and so it's a little bit more complicated. That doesn't happen so much in South Africa, but in South Africa we have certain rituals that demarcate childhood and adulthood, and if you told someone who had undergone one of these rituals that they weren't an adult, even if they didn't have some of these other markers, they would be very offended and insulted. But the way that I'm entering this, or the angle that I'm approaching home leaving, is actually slightly different. It's more connected to my broader PhD work, which has been on home leaving. I'm studying the proliferation of households in census data, which has all sorts of different implications for families, for women, for children, and for welfare in general. And so I'm quite interested in the household formation behavior of home leavers. But I'm not going to speak about that so much right now. That's just a bit of a signpost. All right, so in general, what do we know about home leaving in the developed world? This is where the bulk of the literature sits. And what we know is that there has been a slight increase in age at which people have left home from about the 1970s, which sort of coincides as well with sort of the onset of globalization and increasingly precarious work. There is a large literature on this, but I want to focus on this because I have perhaps a little bit cheekily titled my presentation, "And Home Leaving Looks a Lot Like Italy," which is based on this literature here, which is the idea that there are 2 main home leaving patterns in Europe. An earliest early pattern and a latest late pattern. So the idea is that the earliest early pattern is one where people detach relatively early, around 18, 19, from a household, perhaps live independently for a little bit, and then get married or cohabiting, potentially a bit later. Whereas in Southern Europe, there's this late pattern where people remain in the parental home for a very long time, till age maybe 6, 27, 28. And often home leaving happens when people get married. And these differences have been the topic of a lot of research, and the idea is that there's some cultural norms which often find expression in the welfare state. So the idea is that there are stronger family ties it says my internet connection is unstable. I hope people can still hear me. I'm just going to keep going. The idea is that there are stronger family ties in Southern Europe, and this is expressed in, for example, a lot more pension spending in Italy or Southern Europe, compared to more, for example, spending on unemployment in Northern Europe. And I hope that I haven't hashed that explanation, because I know that there are quite a few, or I think there are quite a few people who have contributed to this literature in the audience. Yeah, I did a good job. Okay, what do we know about the developing world? Well, having looked at this literature, which is a bit more diverse, is that, well, diversity really difference and variation, because there is just a lot more territory to cover. So for example, in Uruguay, home leaving was delayed, but in Malaysia it seemed to increase. The labor market seemed to trigger home leaving in Mexico, but marriage was the main reason in northern Ethiopia. And women leave home sooner than men, also, but not in Indonesia or Japan. Okay, so there's a lot of variation, and it seems that what is coming out of this literature and from the developing world is that, like, political economy, demographics, and so on, it means that context, that background is really important. And so it's quite important that I provide you with some context now about South Africa. So South Africa has pretty recently, which was a regime where there was white minority rule on the country. They segregated people by race and imposed a very extractive labor institution on the Black populations. So the whole system was predicated on cheap Black labor for white South Africa. So there were 4 official race groups: Black, African, Colored, Asian, Indian, and white. And we still collect demographic data on these groups today. To sort of quantify and understand the legacy of apartheid. And what's really important is there was this really big migrancy was set up, which has been active in the region for more than 100 years. And what this was an oscillating system where often men from rural areas would go and work on mines or in industrial areas, single-sex worker hostels, and then only return to rural areas, rural homeland areas, often when they took a break from work. And this really broke up men and women, and it is a very anti-family system and has had long-term impact on life in South Africa. So after apartheid, where do we sit? South Africa is an upper middle income country, but we have extremely high levels of unemployment and are possibly amongst the, if not the most unequal in the world. And this is owed to the structure of the labor market that was set up during apartheid. So essentially, because apartheid impoverished and undereducated people, race and gender are still important markers of advantage or disadvantage today. So what also happened in the post-apartheid period was there was a massive expansion in social expenditure, but this mainly targeted children and the elderly. And though we have high levels of unemployment, there was no unemployment support. And unemployment is especially for the youth. So on the screen there, I've got some statistics: 64% of 15 to 24-year-olds and 42% of 25 to 34-year-olds were unemployed by the expanded definition in 2017, 6% for the total working age population. So this is really high. Okay, so after apartheid, there were all these debates about what was going to happen to labor migration, marriage, and the household. And essentially, marriage is declining, labor migration is still important. But what's quite important is that whilst household size has fallen, households have not necessarily become more nuclear. Instead, and I'm quite interested if anybody else in this audience has seen this happening in their countries, there's been a pattern of household gender polarization. What this means is that people, or that men and women are increasingly living in households that are male or female only. For women, this often means living with men, it's often living alone. So South Africa is unusual in that it has very high levels of single person households, up to like a quarter in 2011, obviously related to long history of labor migrancy, and this is something that I've been studying. Okay, and so essentially something that's important is that childcare has essentially been linked from marriage in South Africa. In 2008, 58% of children under the age of 18 lived without a co-resident father. So how does home leaving fit into all of this? What do we know about home leaving in South Africa? The answer is, as far as I can tell, not very much. The only empirical study I could really find on home leaving specifically was a study by Charles Simpkins, who uses the 2015 General Household Survey, which is a large cross-sectional survey to find that most young adults stay at home. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take Charles Simkins's classification of who counts as a home leaver, and I'm going to apply it to about 13 cross-sections across the post-apartheid period. And because there doesn't seem to be that much work on this topic in South Africa, I'm really going to be trying to answer quite like immediate questions. Like, what are the trends? Who are home leavers? Where do they go? And when do they leave? All right, so the data I'm using just very briefly is, these are household surveys collected by StatsSA for the post-apartheid period. So we don't have good data because often the censuses exclude large portions of the Black population. So we have these annually collected representative cross-sections, which I've reweighted a little bit, which is also been part of my PhD work. And how do we identify home? I don't want to get into this too much. Essentially, it's in their relation to the household head, for example, but children and grandchildren count as stayers. And then there's some more complicated rules for other categories like other relatives. Okay, so here's sort of my main results. So having allocated young adults, so I'm looking at people aged 15 to 35. What do the trends look like over time? And what you can see is that well, they're pretty stable. If you look at panel A there, which is just by sex. Sorry, the gray bar is some ID issues. There's some missing variables that make it hard to identify home leavers, and so it's a little bit overestimated in that part of the graph. But essentially, it's pretty stable at about 40%. So I agree with Charles Simpkins that most people stay at home. But if we look by race, if we just aggregate by race, we can see that there's certainly some adjustment after apartheid. That's quite important. We can see Black men increasing the rate at which they leave home, and white men decreasing it. And of course, this is related to how people are interacting with this landmark institutional change. Okay, so who are home leavers? So as I mentioned before, in terms of social protection, there isn't very much for young adults. So what I've done here is I've divided the population into young adults aged 15 to 35 are in the first two columns, either as stayers or adults plus on the last column. And living with someone who is a pensioner or a CSG is a child support grant recipient or any other kind of grant recipient compared to stayers or adults. They are the least likely to live in households where there's grant income flowing in. By contrast, they are the most likely to be, they're living in households that are most reliant on labor market earnings. And what leavers also look like is they sort of look like labor migrants in that they're often living alone, living in urban areas, and living in informal dwellings. So when do people leave home in South Africa? Well, as you can see, this is an age-specific rate of home leaving, and we can see that people are leaving relatively late. It's quite diffused over time, over age, and only after age 26, 27 do home leave of people will haven't left home. This definition. All right, so why might people be leaving home? Well, what I've done here is I have charted the rate at which people leave home over age according to these mutually exclusive categories. So if you look at my legend, what I've done is divided into groups where they're either not married and employed, married and employed, not married, not employed, and so on. And then the purple line is the unconditional rate. So I haven't put any functional form on this, which is why there's a bit of instability at the bottom there, particularly in the blue line, just because sample size is small. But essentially what you can see is that for women, if they are married, regardless of employment status, so that blue line and that gold line are very, very high, but they're likely that you've left home. The story is more complicated for men. If you look at the unconditional line for men, you can see that either if you have a job or you're married, you're likely to live home. But if you're married and you have a job, then you're most likely. So things are a bit more tied in with the labor market for men. And this is obviously also related to marriageability in the context of high employment. Okay, so there's a lot of information on this graph, but okay, just bear with me a little bit. what I'm looking at, it's the relationship to people, it's the relationship to the household. So these are the households that Homely can see, firstly, and also very relevant to the keynote that we've just listened to, is the expansion in women who leave to be cohabiting spouses instead of married spouses. Men are overwhelmingly more likely to leave to head their own households, but also I'd like to draw your attention to the continued importance of people who leave to be other relatives of the head. So this really points to the continued relevance of complex household structures in South Africa. Like I pointed out earlier, it's not necessarily the case that we are becoming more nuclear. Okay, in the bottom panel, panel B, I've now classified the households that people are in. Is it a single adult household, single adult with children, a couple with children, so that's your classic nuclear household, multi-adult, or multi-adult with children. And where do we see the growth? We see the growth in single person households for men, especially, but also in both cases, these multi-adult households, either with or without children, are really important. So again, we are sort of affirming the importance of these complex household structure, and there is growth at the poles of complexity, of household complexity, if that makes sense. All right, so just to conclude, so I titled this presentation, like I said, Homely in South Africa looks like Italy. And what I mean by that is that it's delayed and sort of diffuse across age, and that marriage seems particularly important for people to leave home. This seems to be particularly important for women. Also, the social explanations for this latest late pattern seem to apply, right? There are very high rates of religiosity in South Africa. There's no general unemployment support. It's not really worth paying any attention to be honest. And the highest paying social grant is the old age pension. But although the structures look the same, there are some South African reasons why this is happening. So firstly, that adjustment in the surprising that employment is coming out as very important for men in particular in the context where youth unemployment is through the roof. And migration, and it's still really important to migrate, whether it's internal temporary migration or just in the sense of migrating to where the jobs are, which is in the cities. And also, as far as I could tell, it seems to be the case that in Italy, childbearing still is happening within the confines of marriage, but this is really not what's happening in South Africa. So it's unlikely that men are sort of leaving the home to start traditional families. And this is because, I just mentioned, that childcare seems to be delinked from marriage in South Africa, and also because of this history of migrant labor. So it really seems to me like there's this pattern where men and women are really being separated, and this is also being affirmed in the patterns of where home leavers are living. Great, thank you so much. I would maybe just like to end off by saying this is my first sort of foreign type of work, and so I'm really open to any criticisms or questions or suggestions. Thanks. Should I start?
Thank you so much.
Right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Amy. Yeah, if you could unshare, that would be great. And thanks for being so attentive to the time. And for those of you who have joined us after the initial introduction, I just want to remind everybody to save your questions for the end. We have 4 papers, and we'll allocate about 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the overall session. So do keep track of the questions, and we can get to those once the 4th paper has been presented. The next paper is a paper called What Are Family Ties by Letizia Mencarini, Arnstein Osve, and Giorgio Piccito, and I believe that Arnie will be presenting, so it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can share my screen here with you. And here it is. And okay, thank you very much. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to do this presentation with this audience and this group. It's still work in progress, this. It's joint work with Letizia Mencarini and Giorgio Piccito. And the title, What Are Family Ties? That seems like a very bold title, of course, in the sense that it's a broad topic. It's a concept that is hard to pin down. Nevertheless, I think it is a very important concept for us as demographers to think about what role family ties have in terms of explaining demographic change and differences between countries and so on. And whereas it may have impact on demographic trends and so on, the focus of this paper is in some sense to take a step back and ask, in terms of measurement, what do we actually get when we try to empirically quantify what family ties are. So it is just to say that when you look out there at the literature, and as I will come to in a slide or two, it is a concept that's gained popularity across the social sciences. But often what we see, actually very frequently, we see that one tends to think about the difference between modern as opposed to traditional family attitudes. And there are many papers that try to think or measure traditional versus modern, and try to use that measure to say something about how societies differ in certain kind of outcomes. It's also treated as a way to think about in-group as opposed to out-group trust. So when family ties are strong and tight, then people tend to trust each other within the family and close relatives, but they have much less trust to the wider public or to the state or other people in society. Now, it's also true that when you look at the literature, it has been expanded in the sense that one simply looking at the attitudes, one has argued that it's not a very satisfactory measure. So many have gone on to expand on it and think about intergenerational relationships, support systems, also the fact measures of how often people meet, how they are living close to each other as opposed to far apart, and so on. But the aim of, yeah, I'm coming to that in a slide, but I can start now. The aim here is to try to make a little critique to the so many papers out there or so many studies out there that tend to think about family ties as something that is one unified concept. So this is trying to unpack it, and as I said, it is still work in progress. I think it's important, and here, without going into any great detail, just to state that the concept of family and the nature of it certainly has found a lot of studies taking a historical perspective, starting with Banfield, but then going on to think about family systems. We have the model by Todd. It's David Rehr, famous study from 1998. And economics and political economy, you have scholars like Alessina and many others who argue that the feature of family ties really does matter to explain economic prosperity, they claim, but also very many other characteristics of our societies. And in sociology, there's a big literature, but I think that the nice part that has made a very nice contribution, at least over the last decades or so, is the focus of intergenerational support how family ties gets translated into preferences for childcare, whether it should be done by grandparents or the mother or relatives, as opposed to be outsourced to public institutions. Again, no, not again. Another feature in a lot of this literature, and also historically, but also in the economics, is that family ties are very often thought about as a cultural trait, in the sense that it's a characteristic that doesn't really change very much over time. Okay, so here, just to give you a little a very quick overview of the various kind of dimensions that have been used empirically. Firstly, simply looking at attitudes towards the family, what people think about the family as an institution. There are other constructs looking at intergenerational relationships. So for instance, what's the relationship between grandparents and parents, parents and children and grandparents? There are also many batteries that try to look into questions such as who should care for the elderly? Should it be the state as opposed to the family? Or for children, is it the state or is it a task mostly for the family? And then another large literature trying to look into more objective measures such as co-residence and geographical proximity. So how close do actually people end up living? So, you know, thinking about leaving home and so on, one important part of that is how far away do actually people live, and to what extent is that some kind of measure of family ties. And also looking at support exchange. So one is to what extent you expect to receive support, but also actual measures of support. And that could be both financial and emotional. So it is just to say that there is a large literature out there, and different measures have been used. What we try to do here is simply to assess empirically if those measures of family ties can be brought together, or whether it's important to treat them as separate elements. So what we're going to do here, I probably said it 2 times already, it's work in progress. We're going to consider one particular survey, and it has one great benefit, and that is that it pretty much contains every questions that you can think about having been used in the literature to measure family ties. And I'm very pleased to also introduce the multi-purpose survey on households, families, social subjects, and life cycle. It's a survey for Italy conducted in 2016. It's taken a little bit of time to get it published and get access to it, but the data is now out, and at least a fair amount of us have now access to this data. So this is pretty much the most recent survey data you would have, thinking about also the presentation by Ron and so on. If you really wanted to have the most updated information about demographics, this would be the survey that you could now look into. Yeah, as I said, it has a huge amount of information about the dimension of family ties, and that's what we're going to exploit. The analytical strategy here is going to be very straightforward. We use structural equation modeling, but the idea here, and if you're not into structural equation modeling, then we can talk about factor analysis and simply try to measure and extract the various kind of dimensions of family ties you would find out of the big battery of questions available. I'm going to show a few tables here, and I'm not going to go through all the details. I'm just trying to point out some of the findings that I think are interesting. But this is just to get you an idea in terms of what this survey contains. So the first one here is to what extent the frequency of meeting between the respondent with the father, the mother, the sibling, and this is then collapsed into an index, which we refer to as FT1. And a larger value here means more frequent meetings, so hence the red plus that you can see there. So it's a positive, something that is a big value means also higher frequency. And then you have phone calling. What is new here is that we also have online calls. So that could be either by Skype or any other means that you would get in touch with your relatives through digital devices. Then there is also messaging, so text messages, WhatsApp, and so on. And here comes the next one, which is the actual distance there is between the respondent, the father, the mother, the sibling. And we have a second last here is a question about to what extent you can expect support, and then a whole battery of from who. And the final one is actual support exchange. Now, the numbers that you might want to care about here is the last one. And although they are not exactly de facto loadings, the way you could think about them as such. So that tells you how closely these factors go together. And most of them go rather closely together, but with the expected support, you can, as you would expect, if you ask relatives that are a little bit more distant, then the response to expected support is also lower, as is reflected also with the lower factor loadings. Okay, and here comes a very big table, and these are about the various kind of attitude questions that this survey contains. I should point out here that if you do put this into a factor analysis, it's not as if you end up with just one index. There are sub-indices here, but I prefer to keep them in one here, just to give you an idea how these items actually correlate. And again, what you should have a look at is the last column, which shows the standardized coefficients. And that gives you an impression of how these things go together. And why do I include all of them? Well, if you start to go through the literature on family ties, what you're going to find is that at least some of them have used some of these indicators to say something about the strength of family ties. I am sure that if you take a few minutes to look through it, you might come up with the idea, and probably rightly so, that some of these items might actually express something slightly different than family ties. Some of them are reflecting more to attitudes to gender equality and gender roles and so on. And that is true, but still, just to point out that when you put all these items together and you look at the last column, you're going to see that not all of them correlate particularly strong. So what we then do is that we hold all of these elements together. And again, I apologize for the rather long table here, but I would like to, as I said, I would try to focus in on a few. So the first I would like to look at is the family openness. So this is now a high score in terms of being open-minded about what the family means. So high score mean that you are less traditional, low score means that you are very traditional. And here I think is the first thing that are coming up as interesting, and that is that the more often you meet, the more modern family attitudes you would have. It also comes up when you look at how frequently you call someone. That is also positively correlated with having more modern attitudes towards the family as a concept. And the one that is negative further down is the one with online calling, and that might have there might be differences if we looked at different cohorts there. And further down, territorial distance, that correlates negatively with the how modern you are in terms of the attitudes to the family. Okay, and here are a few other ones. So the correlation between how frequently you meet and expected support is positive. Also phone call and expected support, and online calling expected support. And here is support exchange. So this is the actual exchange. So this is negatively correlated with territorial distance. So the further apart you live, the less exchange there is, as you would expect. And here we also have the last one, which is to say that the more frequently you meet, the less you actually go on a message and do online calling, which you could also expect. Okay, so we look a bit on the heterogeneity here. And as you are well aware, and what people many would be interested in a country like Italy, is to what extent do we find differences between the North and the South? And here there are some differences that don't turn up quite as you might expect. So for instance, if you look at the frequency of meetings and family openness, being more open to or more modern in terms of your attitudes to the family as an institution, in the North, you find that there is this positive correlation. In the center or the South, there is absolutely no relationship. And so this is interesting and deserves to be looked into a bit further, of course. And then we have online calling, calls online, I should say, and family openness, negative correlation there, nothing in the center and the South.
About time,
sorry?
About time to wrap up.
Right, very good. And here comes the next one, which, okay, I'll move on to the next slide here, because this is the, excuse me, the other source of heterogeneity here. One thing that you would like to look into is to what extent there are differences between educational level. So so you would expect perhaps that those with higher education would have more modern attitudes. But when we look at this, actually, sorry, I pressed the wrong button here. Actually, when you look at the educational levels, there isn't so much difference. It could be taken as a sign for suggesting that there is this cultural trait in terms of family ties are cultural, so it doesn't change with the different levels of education, but it's worthwhile looking into further. Okay, Jim, I'm on my last slide here. So I think what we can draw out of this is that some of these dimensions that are used in the literature, they actually have rather low correlation with others. Some of them have stronger correlation in the North, whereas in the South, there is less of a correlation. Territorial distance obstructs factual expression of family ties, so meeting, support, and exchange. But in the South and the center, we find that this is less prevailing, it should be said, and not preventing. So you could argue that perhaps there is a strong cultural characteristic going on here. And then, as I said, there's hardly any difference over education, whereas we know there has been educational expansion over recent years, and that there are differences in terms of the educational level across different regions. But education seems to be very robust. All right, okay, so I'm coming to the end, and sorry if I run a little bit over. Thank you very much. And I will stop on.
All right. Thank you, Arnie, for that. Much appreciated. A very broad and provocative set of ideas. One of the things that we really had fun doing, Jia and I, when we were organizing this conference, was trying to incorporate papers from all over the world. And so far, we've had one from South Africa, one from Italy, and next we're going to have a paper on marriage in South Korea. And that will be presented by Joan Kim, who is at Penn State University. So Joan, it's yours.
Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen. Can you hear me?
You're good.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Joon Kim, a PhD candidate in sociology and demography from Penn State. And I'm very pleased to present my work on money, work, and avoidance of marriage in South Korea. So as many of you here probably know, that never marrying is rapidly increasing in East Asia, where universal marriage was the norm. And it is a critical source of fertility decline in the region, given almost every childbirth continue to occur within marriage institutions in East Asia. And according to population projections for Japan and South Korea, it is expected that more than 30% of men and 25% of women born after 1985, when they reach to age 50, will remain never married. However, prior research on never marrying has mostly focused on factors associated with marriage delays, which is one pathway leading to never marrying. There is few research on intentional avoidance of marriage among young adults. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on this one dimension of intentional never marrying. So why young adults actively avoid marriage at young age? One of the most prominent explanation in East Asian context was women's economic independence and their reduced economic gains from marriage. And some emphasizes their individualistic attitudes and their rejections to enter traditional institution of marriage, which requires onerous domestic responsibilities and often constrain on their work and freedom and energy. So, but here, in my presentation, I'm going to move away from these female-centered explanations on the rejection of marriage in East Asia. I'm going to focus on these young adults' work dimensions in their lives and how these work dimensions shape their decision to avoid marriage. And then I'm also going to pay attention to not only women, but also for men. So I'm going to focus on two dimensions of work. First one is economic constraint. So in the keynote speech, we discussed about this pattern of disadvantage, and this literature tend to emphasize that these financial constraints or poor economic prospect dampen young adults' transition into marriage. While it is quite well established, it remains unclear whether these economic constraint or poor economic prospect dampen their desire to marry. So far, it received limited empirical support in East Asia as well as in the United States. And second one is more novel and emerging body of literature that tend to focus work dimension that's unsupportive of work-life balance. So this body of literature argue that young adults, the avoiding partnership is deeply rooted in young adults' difficulty to combine work and commitment to others. And they tend to emphasize that these demanding work conditions colonize every dimensions of young adults' lives and leave little time and energy for non-work related activities such as dating or family. And so these type of two explanations received popular support, as well as it has been discussed in many literature, but so far it received little empirical support. And another question is gender differences. So far in East Asia, the previous literature used to find that women's greater economic resources decrease their likelihood of ever marrying. And it has been used to support the evidence that women's economic independence reduces their chance to, increases their chance to never marry. And another dimension is this, whether work-life balance or demanding work is going to shape men's marital decisions. It can be easily argued that this work condition can have greater impact on women's decision to avoid marriage because this proportionate family work tend to fall onto women regardless of their work status. However, there has been recent evidence that this breadwinning ability is increasingly expected for women, and it's important for women's transition into first marriage, like men's transition into first marriage. So it is possible that having financial difficulties or economic limitation could also equally limit women's intentions to marry. And also for men, expectations on men's domestic responsibilities has increased in the marriage institution recently, suggesting that for those men who are subject to long work hours or demanding intense pressure to perform at work, may think that having a family is another source of kind of limitation on their time and freedom and energy. So the research aim is this, how poor economic status and prospect, and also these work characteristic conducive to work-life conflict are associated with the rejection of marriage. And then second one is whether these associations between economic and work variables and the rejection of marriage vary by gender. So I'm going to focus on young Korean adults. This is the proportion of never married men and women by age 50 in Japan and Korea. So it used to be the case that Japanese adults were leading never marrying within East Asia, but according to the population projection, which is this shaded area, Korean young adults who were born after 1985 are expected to lead one of the most significant kind of a prevalence of never marrying. And also young Korean adults are actively avoiding marriage at young age. So this is the marital intentions of young adults at 20s at the time of the interview who were never married. And there has been an increasing trend in negative marital intentions for young adults. And in 2018, almost 24% women at 20s and also almost 15% of men reported that they have no intentions to marry. Briefly talking about the Korean context, there has been a large expansion of non-regular work arrangements, and it has greatly affected the careers and economic prospect of young non-college graduate as well, but also college graduates. And in terms of corporate culture, Korea is famous for having very long hours and intense pressure to perform. And corporate structure, they have this seniority-based wage system, which limit the intra-firm mobility among young new entrants to the labor market, and which eventually decrease the general ability of employers to negotiate their work conditions. So to answer this question, I'm going to use data from the Graduate Occupational Mobility Survey, a repetitive cross-sectional survey that was conducted since 2007 of a nationally representative sample of recent college graduates in Korea. And I'm going to focus on the 3 most recent surveys since 2015. And because the information on marital intentions was included since 2015 and so on. And I'm going to limit the sample to those people who are in 20s at the time of the interview and then who were never married, which consists 95% of the original sample. And the final sample includes 50,333 women and men who were born between 1985 to 1995. Sorry. And the dependent variable is avoidance of marriage. So every respondent who were never married were asked to choose one marital intentions out of 5 options. Do you intend to marry? Yes, I used to, but not anymore. I never wanted to marry, and I haven't thought of it, and then I haven't decided. So I created a dichotomous variable indicating avoidance of marriage if respondents reported I used to, but not anymore, and I never wanted to marry. And then the rest is recorded at 0. And this is the various economic conditions and work conditions that I used as independent variable. Education, so in Korea, almost a large proportion of young adults are in high degree education. So almost 80% who were born in 1985. And I included the junior college versus 4-year college. And given the large majority of sample were in graduated from 4-year college, I also included another dichotomous variable indicating whether respondents graduated from top 20 universities in ranking. And also unemployment, logged monthly income, and fixed term employment, and whether these respondents hold any education along that. And in terms of work conditions, I include work hours as full-time as reference category, less than full-time overwork, and extreme hours of work per week, which is defined by more than 60 hours. And long commute hours defined by if respondents spend more than 1 hour per day commuting, and whether respondents have accessibility to family policies, and whether they are working in the private sector versus public sector, because private sector tend to have this stronger requirement for workers to commit to work. And then occupations, I included professional and the service manual workers at the same time, because there has been a debate over which occupations experience more difficulty in terms of combining work and life. Some people argue that professional are greedy occupations that does not allow any time for other non-work related activities. And some people argue that service manual workers, they tend to have this limited ability to flexibly schedule their work, and their work schedule is often determined by employers' demands. So they tend to experience more difficulty in terms of work-life balance. I also included covariates in my model, including place of residence, living arrangements, parental education, age, and graduate cohorts. This is the descriptive statistic of my sample, And you can clearly see that the positive marital intention is definitely the majority, but not the large majority, and which suggests that people moved away from the universal norms of universal marriage. And almost 14% of female graduates reported that they don't have intentions to marry. And then almost 8% of men reported that they don't have intentions to marry. And then a substantial proportion of young adults also reported that they haven't thought about any marital intentions, and they're not certain about marriage. And it's important to note that the red one is the main focus of my research. And this is descriptive statistic of economic and work conditions. In terms of economic prospect and resources, women tend to fare poorly in the labor market compared to men in general. Another interesting part is that a large proportion of young adults after graduation, they are unemployed. Around 20% of women and then 18% of men reported that they're involuntarily unemployed. And these young adults tend to prepare for the examination certificates to find a good job, or just continuously seeking for their job. And then in terms of work conditions, in general, men tend to do more work, spend more time in the labor market, and women, however, spend longer time commuting. because it's related to the fact that women tend to stay greater proportion of women tend to stay with their parents. And in terms of occupation, there's not much gender differences in terms of professional. However, service manual worker, almost twice the level of men are in either service and manual worker compared to women. So this is the logistic regressions predicting avoidance of marriage or no intentions to marry for women and men. So model 1 presents result for women, model 2 present result for men. So the general finding here is that for women, poor economic conditions is associated with a greater likelihood of rejecting marriage, which contrasts to this kind of a popular conception of women's economic independence is promoting them to move away from marriage. So it's also financial constraints limits women's desire or intentions to marry. And in terms of work conditions, greater work hours, more than full-time, including overwork, extreme work, as well as long commute hours was associated with the greater likelihood of rejecting marriage. And also women working in a private firm tend to more likely to reject marriage. And interestingly, those people, despite these people are single and potentially childless young adults, having no access to family policy at the workplace was associated with a greater likelihood of rejecting marriage. And professionals, despite having greater economic resources, they're more likely to reject marriage. And then findings are similar for men in terms of economic status and prospect. So poorer economic prospect and status are associated with the greater likelihood of rejecting marriage for men as well. But work conditions are quite similar, but a little bit different for men. So in terms of extreme work hours, which is defined by more than 60 and more than 60 hours per week, was not significantly associated with this men's intentions to reject marriage. And as well, this men's limited access to family policies at the workplace was not associated with their intentions to reject marriage. And also male professionals, despite having greater economic resources to marry, they're more likely to reject marriage compared to non-professional, which includes white-collar occupations or other types of occupations except professional. So in terms of, in order to test these gender differences, I interacted this each variable with gender variable. And then I'm only presenting here the statistically significant result only. And I found that in terms of work hours, the positive association between extreme work hours on the rejection of marriage was larger for female. And then in terms of private interactions with gender, the positive influence of positive association with these private working in the private sector and the rejection of marriage was lower for women, suggesting that it was greater for men in terms of their marital intentions to avoid marriage. So the limitation, I have a lot of limitations, which includes this. I'm only focusing on young adults who are college graduates, and there's almost more than 20% of Korean young population who are not holding a college degree. And there are important confounders potentially in terms of their values and traits that determine both marital intentions as well as their kind of work conditions and characteristics. And intentions could change, but I was taking a snapshot of these young adults' marital intentions, so I was not able to track their changes in marital intentions. So the implication finally is this potentially that ensuring solid economic prospect and foundation and creating workplace that is supportive of work-life balance for both young women and men could promote family formation in Korean context. And thank you for listening. I welcome every comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Joan. That certainly sounds familiar and makes a lot of sense in the East Asian context. I appreciate that. And the fourth paper we have will be from Alicia Adsera and Federica Karen, and they will be talking about something very closely related to the keynote speech today on cohabitation and work. So Alicia, please take it away.
Okay, let me share. Here we are. Oops. Oh, one sec. To my slideshow. Okay, do you see it?
Looks good.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you for having me into this very nice session. And as Jim said, this is very related to what Ron presented today. So this is joint project with Federica Querin, who is at the European University Institute. And today I'm going to present a first part of the project that is related to data from the European panel in the 1990s. And then we are doing more work, more recent data. So what is the, what is the motivation of this paper? Well, we know that couples, when they compared to single individuals, they have some consumption-related gains. We know there's public goods and they are pooling risks. So in that sense, also there's some gain of becoming a couple. And at the same time, we know that there's inter-household specialization, and that may be enabling some of those couples actually to produce those goods, especially some of the public goods in terms of, household management, so on and so forth. At the same time, another concern is that individuals entering different marital status may be selected in different ways. It's not the same somebody who chooses to start a union or to start a marriage, or people who end up being single. So the goal of this project is to compare men's and women's changes in labor market effort and in financial status upon entering a union. And this is going to be either cohabitant or marriage, and we're going to differentiate on that. And so what are the types of things we are interested in looking in terms of these changes in labor market effort and financial status? We want to look at the contributions of the adjustments of these changes to total income, whether there's, this is maybe related to income pooling and to changes in the family size. And just going to, as I said, talk now about the IUSSP, which is the old panel of European Union from 1994 to 2001, and we are starting to work with more recent data. So there are some general facts that we all know about the difference between marriage and cohabitation. And so in general, we know that married men earn more than single and cohabiting men, and this is what's been known as the marriage premium. Also, we know that there's an evidence of a reduction lately of some of those differences. So that's some interesting things of maybe telling us something about changes in specialization. Also, we know that the number of children explains a gap, a large part of the gap for women, but not that much for men in terms of the differences in earnings. And also we know that some of these differences, when we look at differences across countries, may be mediated by some tax regulations that may be what people call the marriage penalty in some countries. So because we're going to have different countries, this is something also that potentially down the road it's important to consider. Which will be the two pathways that we may consider when we're thinking about cohabitation versus marriage? Well, a natural one is to think about the specialization. So when we think about whether people entering cohabiting unions or marriages from singlehood, it may be because they choose to specialize. And it's very difficult to actually establish some type of a causal argument to say men specialize in labor market skills. And some people have attempted to do that. We know though that there are some things that may be affecting the degree of specialization. If we believe that unions tend to be more unstable, or maybe some unions are less likely to pool their incomes, and this is some recent evidence, that may be deterring some specialization, and that may reflect on the labor market effort that people put and the income that they are obtaining. Also, we have recent work that has been showing that the birth of children actually increases the saliency of specialization. And we observe that in general, with the babies are born, you're going to see an increase in the specialization of the households. Also, we have a smaller gender gap in hours of housework for cohabiting than married, also linking this to potential specialization. Though in terms of time spent with children, there don't seem to be such huge differences, at least in some data from the UK. So it seems to be more related to housework and to labor market work. The other way that there may be a pathway that may be explaining differences between cohabitation and marriage would be related to selection. So as I said, maybe the people who choose to cohabit or to marry are different to start with. And that may be explaining some of these differences that we're going to observe in their income and their labor market effort. So maybe men that have more potential are more attractive in the marriage market. And so that's, for example, McDonald has worked looking at how selection may be important in marriage, in male marriage premium, and also how this is also compounded by changes in employers' discrimination. And also, for example, recent work by Ong and Wang looks how women select higher income men on online dating sites. And, you know, many people in the conference yesterday and today already, and we know from especially East Asian countries that also we have this idea of which will be a potential attractive spouse. Income is a big part of the picture. For women, on the other end, more earning potential, they may choose to postpone marriage and cohabit first to find a better match, or to maybe gain some experience in the labor market. So also another important thing is that cohabitation may be very differently prevalent across countries, and especially in this period we are looking in the data, which is still the late 1990s, prevalence of cohabitation was very diverse across Europe. And here you have in the sample, very low in Spain, Portugal, Greece, Italy, mostly Southern Europe, plus Ireland, and already relatively high in Denmark and Finland and all the Nordic countries. And this is prevalence in our sample of people who are 18 to 55. So how prevalent a union is going to affect how selected somehow these people who are in unions are, how stable those unions are, and also the selection itself and the prevalence may be affected by the labor market structure on its own. So these are the two ways that may be affecting specialization and selection. And where we're going to go is we're going to go to the data and look at the changes around transitions to marital status when entering unions and when entering marriages, and see how those vary. So we're going to use the panel data of 94-2001 waves of the European Community Household Panel of 14 European countries, but not Sweden because it doesn't have a proper longitudinal structure. We have individuals 20 to 50-year-old because we want to observe some of the issues of retirement and too early unstable labor markets and have something more solid. And we have people who are single or in their observed first union or marriage. We are not going to include widow, divorce, separated. Even after this event occurs, these are going to be dropped from the sample. And some of the shortcomings we have in this data is that this is annual data. Of course, this means we're going to miss some of the very short cohabitation and marriage spells. And another issue is that we don't really have the month of the union or the marriage. So we only know whether this person married and entered this household or entered this household to cohabit in a particular year. So we have also done some experimentation using, 1 year back or 2 years back, just trying to account for the fact that things may happen in January, things may happen in December. We're going to run 2 types of models, and I'm going to focus mostly on the results on the second one. So what I'm going to look at is whether there's going to be a difference in the outcome variables that I'm going to tell you in a moment, whether people are in a cohabiting, in a married relationship compared to single, which is going to be our default case. And then we're going to focus, as I said, mostly in the differences of the transition of the year the transition happens. And I want to say that this is important because this is a shortcoming, and this is just what we're doing in here. We're just assuming what will happen if we just look at the year where people move from single to cohabit, when people move from single to married, or when people move from cohabit to married. Of course, changes may ensue later on, and this is another thing that we have to be, we will be looking later on. But at this point, we're going to focus in that 1 year. So just think about that when you look at the results. And which are the variables we are going to be looking at? Well, we're going to think about, this result of a specialization and this income pooling and this rationale of getting together. That has many dimensions. One thing is an individual dimension, another thing is a total household dimension. So we're going to look at work hours, individual work earnings, individual total income, household income, and then to account for well-being and household composition, we are going to also look at income, taking into account the household composition, so adult equivalent household income. This is just some descriptives. So what you can really see is that for men, when you compare single to cohabiting and married, they have more individual income and they have more work hours. So they are putting more effort. For women, conversely, when you really look at total individual income or work hours, the highest is for cohabiting, but they drop if they are in marriages. And of course, there are more children in marriages than there are among single or among cohabiting. So let me show you first the deal of what's going to happen to household income. So when these people get together, do we expect income compared to the household where they are originating and compared to the household where they are moving into, is that increasing or not? And we're going to look both at the total income, and that will be taking into account all the income of people with whom they lived before and all the income of people with whom they live now. And then we are going to also look at adult equivalent, which is going to take into account that household composition, which is going to weight depending on the age. So when you look at the adult equivalent, yes, indeed, when people transfer, and I'm going to focus here in the difference, as I said, when people move from single to married, single to cohabit, we are observing an increase. So for women and for men, and there's an increase in the adult equivalent household income, which is to some extent to be expected. Interestingly, when we look at total household income, this is not as clear. And in here, what I'm doing is I'm showing you in the first column, the overall sample of what's going on in the total household income change when you move to marriage and you move to cohabiting, and what's happening depending on what country are you? And this is a country with very low prevalence. So this is basically Southern Europe with Ireland. And then the high prevalence on the other end would be Nordic countries. And what we observe here is quite interesting. In fact, the increase in total household income happens in high prevalence, but it doesn't necessarily happen in low. And here I'm showing you for women, for men it's essentially the same. If anything, there may be a marginal drop in household income. And so when we go back into the composition, in fact, what's going on is that maybe in Southern Europe, as the data has shown, many of these people are coming from their parental household, whereas in Nordic Europe, they are really coming from maybe, being in roommates or being on their own, which is a very different type of composition. So they may even not moving or changing in total household income, or maybe even dropping. What about individual income? So when you really look at the women, the story of specialization ensues. So what you really see is there's a huge drop in total individual income in the year of the transition from single to marriedhood. And this is really much higher from married than to cohabiting. So you really see the drop much more important when women marry. Even from cohabiting to marry, there's a drop for women entering marriage. When you look at what's going on in terms of not total income, but just work income, and you try to explain how this is related to the fact that they may be putting more or less hours, we control 4 hours in here, and even controlling 4 hours, we observe a drop in the women's work income. And again, this is much larger when women are moving into marriages, either from singlehood or from cohabiting unions. So there's a clear idea that when women enter marriages, they seem to specialize in somewhere, at least drop effort into the labor market. And the last thing we are looking at is specifically the effort, and that's going to come from the work hours. And in here, I'm going to differentiate whether people have children or not. And so when you look at this table, you're going to see the hours that women and men work, and the change, in fact, of those hours when they are moving from single to married, single to cohabit, cohabit to married, and whether these people nowadays are parents or they are childless. So in the first 2 columns, you can see naturally that there's a large drop of women's hours. So there's a large drop on the effort of women when they move to marriage. And that drop is much higher for women who become mothers. They can be mothers at this point or become mothers around that point. We haven't differentiated that in this particular table, compared to women who actually are childless all around that period. And so there's really a clear link that some of this effort may be exacerbated by the fact of a specialization in the labor market and a specialization in the caretaking task. Contrary, for the men, there's an increase in effort, in hours work, and especially for those who eventually become parents or are parents at that point. So what have we learned from all these tables? And again, this is just some of the variables that we've been looking at. So the main findings is that married couples seem to specialize more than cohabitants. the women own income decreases, but in fact, when you really look at adult equivalent household, it increases. So there's really a specialization, but there's a gain in terms of adult equivalent household. There's a clear change in hours that they work, especially with around the marital transition, and this is exacerbated when these people are parents. And we don't really see a significant gain in household income when there's a move from cohabitation to marriage. An important thing that we noted, and this is one thing we are exploring, I didn't have time to show it here, there's huge differences across countries or regions. So the change in total household income from single to cohabitant or married is smaller in general in Europe than in the US. And in Europe, an interesting thing is that when you're looking at Southern Europe, there may even be a loss or almost no change, because in fact, these people are coming from relatively wealthier or richer households because they are with their parents. And so one thing that we want to look at is that with whom these people are living before. And cohabitants, and that's something we haven't shown, we have been looking at not only the year of the transition, but just a year before. Cohabitants sometimes seem to increase the effort a little bit before moving together. So just getting ready to have that income to be able to move together, whether really the decrease in marriage, in income for the transition of marriage woman really seems to occur around the time of the marriage. So there's a bit of a difference in the timing. Some preliminary cross-country difference. We observe, not unsurprisingly, a labor division weaker in Northern Europe than in Southern Europe. And then when we are looking at these things, we wonder why, when we're controlling for work hours, actually this gap decreases. We've been looking and thinking that there may be more selection in countries with lower labor force participation of what women are in the labor force. Also, there may be more occupational discrimination, so the gender gap is much larger in those countries, and that piles up into the changes of income. And there may be also differences in the prevalence, because this is the late 90s, when in those countries still the prevalence of the unions was lower. So what are we planning to do for further steps? We are starting to do similar analysis with the IUSSP, because the idea is we want to see what's going on now, where 15 years have elapsed, and in fact now the prevalence is high everywhere. And so has this changed the degree of specialization, especially in Southern Europe? Then we are going to look at changes around the number of children more carefully, and then study how much they account for those difference in changes in the adult equivalent, and also on the changes of effort, but by really pinpointing more whether the number of children are happening, the changes around the marital transitions. We'll also look at educational gradient. And finally, we are planning on adding some labor market characteristics to account for not only structure, but also the tax system. So hopefully I managed to get on time.
Thank you, Alicia. You were right on time, almost to the second. So well done. Thank you. So that wraps up our 4 papers for this session. And as I said at the outset, I don't want to sell ourselves short in terms of the time we have available for question and answer due to our late start. But so I guess that means that we will continue through to 11:30, leaving 15 or 20 minutes for questions and responses. And I think there are a variety of ways you can let me know or let us know you have a question. Type something in the chat box or the Q&A, or you can even raise your hand virtually, and we will try to identify who has questions. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how to deal with the Q&A here. Is this, can I make this person able to ask the question, anonymous attendee, or is that external?
This is a seminar mode, so anyone can talk. Unmute yourself and talk, I think.
Okay, I have an anonymous attendee who has a question for Alicia.
But identify yourself, please.
No, I think it's still a webinar, and they cannot.
It's a webinar?
Yeah, they cannot unmute themselves.
Oh, I see. Okay, so Philip or somebody should unmute the person.
Yeah, but our first question is, it is anonymous. Professor Rimmel, do you mind just?
I'll read the question then. Yeah. So this is a question for Alicia, and it said, could the relationship be opposite in that the increase in men's income leads to a higher chance to transit to partnership or marriage?
Yes, for sure. That's what we said. That, I mean, on one end, that would be the selection issue. So we said there's two pathways. We have selection and specialization. So if you're thinking that there's an increase in income that makes that man more attractive, that may increase those chances of partnership. And so, yeah, that will be pointing more into the selection. And that's where as we were saying, we were looking also at the timing of where these things are happening. So we are, looking at more the period before and to periods before. As I said, it's a very clear change for women around the marriage, which is not so high for men. So yeah, certainly, maybe that some of that change, which is not so high for men, may be happening even before. We know it happens for cohabitants, and we interpret that as getting ready to transit into a separate household and being able to, set up their own household separate. But yeah, so we cannot disentangle in this sense specialization from selection.
Thank you.
Those of you, it's a small group, not that large. If you would like to ask questions, you can ask. One of us can unmute you so you can speak.
Right. You can just type question in the chat box.
Yeah, we can unmute you.
I'll be able to take care of that. We have plenty of time, so feel free.
I think
here we have a question. Yeah. Okay, this is a question from Yifan Shen, and it's for Alicia. I don't think I can unmute you, so I will read it. And the question is, do you find any interesting difference in results that you didn't have time to talk about when using different measures of the year of marriage? You mentioned those marrying in January and December may be different.
Yeah. Sorry, I think I didn't explain myself. I was rushing through it. What I was saying is that since I don't have the month of marriage, a marriage could occur in January, it could occur in December. And so when I observe the change in overall income and I'm only capturing the annual income, that change may be many minor. For example, if that marriage just happened in December, and that may be something very recent. And so if I want to attach that change of income to the marriage itself, it may be only capturing just 1 month. So that's why we move. But certainly, ideally we would love to have the changes, the month, but I'm not sure whether there's a good theory. It will be interesting to think about what theories will affect the seasonality of the marriages. We know about seasonality of births. I don't know about seasonality of marriages. Can I ask one question, Jim?
Please. Absolutely.
For Arnie, and I sort of asked him already, but since now we can discuss. I'm interested on these geographic differences and how he interprets some of these things, because that was something that naturally I was thinking into. So he has two things. One thing is the territorial distance, whether you are further apart and live, and in general you seem to be less modern. And my sense is, whether there's some type of idea of continuity of imposition of what will be the norm that the parents are thinking that you are supposed to follow, but you still have migrated or moved, or who would be the most likely to move, and how far is this territorial distance? Are we talking about, a different province, or we are talking about no commuting distance? And then, if you could expand more about this idea of the no finding that you have on the South. And so how do we interpret that? Because, I'm very curious about this sense of, is that people still feel, that they have to follow the norms in a way, or?
So let me start with the latter. And actually for your first question, I might need some assistance from Giorgio when it comes to the exact classification of the distances, because I cannot quite remember exactly how that's defined. But when it comes to the no finding interpretation, so let me make a proposal and see if you think it makes sense. My thought was that you could imagine that there is a difference in terms of, and I don't know how quite to express it, where let's say meeting and attitudes to the family are in the North ingrained as some kind of an exchange mechanism, whereas you could in the South, my idea is that the family attitude, or the way you think about the family, is a more salient cultural trait, in the sense that that is something that they believe and they feel about, which is kind of independent of the extent to whether you feel it's necessary to meet or not. So in this, if that's the interpretation, then you could argue that in the South, this is a more salient trait, that what you think about the family is truly a cultural trait that is not dependent upon, let's say, the kind of interaction that you have. But it's a proposal for an interpretation. I'm not sure what you think about it.
Yeah, no, it's a possibility. I think you're right in sense that it's the social norm is stronger, or it's different. Also, there's been migration, much more from in that direction and in the other direction. So that may be something that may be playing around, and you have some interactions of South and so how do you define somebody who moved from the South and is now in the North, or who comes from traditions on the South? You don't know that.
So in the analysis that I have presenting you here, that's not taken into account. Okay. So basically, it's I'm taking the current resident, if you are in the North or the Center or the South. So they're clearly, but we know there is a lot of South to the North migration, and that could confound somehow these findings here. But that is yet to be done. We haven't done that yet. Yeah. So you could, for instance, but what you could do is to sort of try to trace out where they come from, and you redo the analysis with that kind of classification, and you might have different effects or different relationships.
Yeah, that the people who select into moving are different. Yeah,
exactly.
People who stay, and there's a lot. But I don't know if it's in this recent generation. Yeah.
Still to be done.
Thanks a lot, guys. So we have two questions in the queue. The next one is from Yongzai.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, I truly enjoyed the presentations, and I have a general question to I think everyone in this panel, is that now in Ron's keynote speech, and as well in Kim and Adessa's presentations, but the concept of marriage and cohabitation are presented more or less as two static concepts. But we did not. Nobody clearly defined what cohabitation exactly is. And we know that the concept of cohabitation has been evolving over time and varies greatly across space in different countries. So my question is that, how does this, the subtlety or the ambiguity of cohabitation in this concept affect our measurement as well as our understanding of the family system and marriage system across different societies?
Any of you can respond as you like. Alicia, you're muted.
I was giving, since I already talked, I'm happy to respond, but if she wants to talk first, I'm happy to let her talk first.
I think this is related to my earlier question to Ron. So cohabitation now is considered as a different form of union, different from marriage. So in order to consider what is cohabitation, one should ask what is marriage. So marriage, as I proposed, was socially constructed long time ago. And then that was related to property. It's a legal right. So it's a legal, and in the West, it was sanctioned by the church. So it has a legal implications pertaining to property rights and shared household, inheritance, and so on. I think the answer to your question is a union relationship or intimate relationship that doesn't obligate husband, wife, and children to the legal obligations. So it's a non-marital union. But that's how I think that's how we usually, it's an intimate relationship involving sex, involving sharing residence and daily lives, but not legally, not having legal obligations.
But that's, sorry. Am I speaking?
Go ahead.
When I can follow up with that. Can I? Oh. So related directly to the question that was posed. If you remember, there was a table I showed you when I was looking at the changes depending on the prevalence on the country. So if a country has a very high cohabiting prevalence or a very low cohabiting prevalence, and that goes a little bit to what Yuxie was saying. So depending on the prevalence of the country, the meaning of cohabitation has been changing. And then who has chosen to cohabit may be different. As you have much higher levels of cohabitation, the average characteristics of the person who's cohabiting correspond more to the average person in the country, so that they are less selected in this way. And they also, their behavior may resemble more, maybe potentially even the marriage in other ways. So so one of the things that we do and we are interested in looking is what's going on now, for example, when you look at Spain 20 years later compared to what it was going on in the 1990s, because it has moved from hardly anybody to basically everyone. And so then the selection would be very different. And I agree, the meaning has changed. And then that may, in that case, it may make the marriage more selected in another way. So this is an empirical issue, but the meaning has changed depending on the overall prevalence. I don't know if this addresses your question. And that's what we're trying to do in the cross-country comparison by looking at the underlying prevalence of a country, because we think it's, as you say, it's very meaningful.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left and we have 2 remaining questions. So I think maybe it would be best to allocate the remaining time to those, both of which are about the talk on Korea. The first is from Ryohei Mogi. Ryo, you're up.
Yep, okay. I cannot start my video.
That's okay.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, okay. Without my face. I was interested in the uncertainty and never thought about marriage group. And you categorize this group into the group of yes, they intended to marriage. And my question is, did you try to separate these uncertainty group, 2 uncertainty groups from the group of yes?
That's a very good point. I also ran a multinomial probit regression, predicting all types of different answers, and also predicting estimating no versus yes only, taking the uncertainty and never thought groups out. And then I found consistent results that these economic conditions increases, poor economic condition increases, and then this demanding work also increases the likelihood of rejecting marriage. Is that answer your question?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Okay. No, because of my previous research also research related to fast birth in Japan, and yeah, that's why I was interested. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And then the last one also for Jolene is from Esther Lazari.
I was wondering if you thought about looking at cohabitation as well, meaning that people that don't want to marry might be in general against stable relationship in general, or maybe just against marriage in particular.
Yes, that's a very good point, and I wish I could measure this, but the thing is this, most Korean survey does not collect any information on whether these young adults are cohabitating or not, given this high stigma against cohabitations. So I was really sad to not see this South Korean case in Professor Lestage's presentation, just because we don't have data on cohabitation. So it'll be really nice if I can also extend my findings to their intentions to cohabitate or forming these romantic stable partnerships.
That's quite interesting in the context, Joan, of Ron's point about Japan not asking this question in earlier surveys because people thought it didn't exist or it was too stigmatizing to ask. Should be asked. But at any rate, I think, yeah.
We also did. When I first proposed those questions, people were skeptical. The two kinds of people. One said there's no cohabitation. The other group said, no, people will never tell you whether they cohabit, even they did. They were wrong. We asked questions, we got a very high percentage of positive responses.
Indeed, yes. So the moral is ask, yeah. So with that, I think we should wrap up for today. Thanks everybody for attending the session. Apologies for things going a little bit longer than anticipated. And I'd like to encourage the remaining 40 or so of you to absolutely join us starting tomorrow again, same time, 8 o'clock in the morning for those of us on the East Coast of the US. And you can figure out the time that corresponds to wherever you are, but we have 6 more fantastic papers to be presented in 2 separate sessions across the period of 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock on the East Coast tomorrow. So look forward to seeing you then. And again, thank you very much, both to the presenters and to those of you who engage with the presenters in the Q&A. Much appreciated and look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.